All right. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this session of the Green New Deal discussion. And if you've never joined us before, our Green New Deal discussion is supposed to be a way for environmental and climate justice activists of all stripes and who use all sorts of tactics to come together to decide on what a Green New Deal will look like in Allegheny County and how we can combine all of our tactics and all of our knowledge together to fight as one unit, to have a solid and unified message to make a Green New Deal a reality in Western Pennsylvania. And with that said, at the beginning of each and every one of our panel discussions, we have a tradition of reading a land acknowledgement and also a redlining acknowledgement before we begin. And first is the land acknowledgement, and it goes like this. We acknowledge that the land we are occupying is stolen land. The land we currently call Pittsburgh was peopled by several native tribes, including the Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, and more that were displaced from other regions. We also acknowledge that this country was built by African people, stolen from their land. It was their enslaved labor that enabled the growth of this country. Our more recent, deeply discriminatory collective actions, laws, and policies, such as redlining, forced evictions, and demolition of neighborhoods, have continued that legacy of exploitation and harm. It is only by acknowledging this reality that we can begin to make reparations. Land acknowledgement itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed actions. So before we get into the overview of the two essays we were to read this week from Naomi Klein's book called On Fire, I would like everyone to hearken back to the very first Green New Deal discussion panel we had, if you were there, and to try to remember the video that Helen Gearhart showed everyone. It was narrated by Ocasio-Cortez, and it was a story about how things could be if the Green New Deal comes together in the nick of time. And it relates to what we're going to talk about tonight. So, that is my introduction and land acknowledgement and redlining acknowledgement. Shall we move on to the overview of the essays?
Sure. Thanks, Renzi. I'm Carol Gonzalez, and I'd like to just give us a brief gist of the two chapters that we're referring to in this thematic session. And the chapters are around the Radical Vatican chapter, for those of you who are familiar with the Burning Case for a Green New Deal, Naomi Klein's book. And the other chapter is Art of the Green New Deal. In the essay that explores Naomi Klein's invitation to participate in the Vatican's press conference in 2015 on Laudato Si, and a two-day symposium to shape an action plan around Laudato Si. It was called People and Planet First, the imperative to change course. Klein argues that it will take an extraordinarily broad-based movement to demand the fundamental changes, one capable of navigating political disagreements, including with the Roman Catholic world, a world of 1.2 billion people. As a secular Jewish feminist, Naomi writes of her surprise at being invited to the Vatican in the first place for such an historic gathering, and of finding so much that she is grateful for in Laudato Si, including that St. Francis, Pope Francis's namesake, called creatures by the name of brother and sister, and how this papal encyclical affirms that the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism. Laudato Si speaks more about creation care than the traditional stewardship or duty, because when one cares for something, it is something one does with passion and love, a passion for the natural world, often more familiar for the church in the global south. Klein quotes one of her dinner companions, Patrick Carolyn, who's the executive director of a DC-based Franciscan Action Network, who shared that Lenin supposedly said that what the Russian Revolution had really needed was not more Bolsheviks, but 10 St. Francises of Assisi. In the Art of the Green New Deal chapter, it opens with the creative video that Renzi referred to, that we opened this whole Green New Deal discussion series with. A video that in the first 48 hours that it went online was viewed over 6 million times. Because the Green New Deal taps into this powerful force around envisioning a transformation, and how art is so essential if we're going to win the battle for hearts and minds that will determine if the Green New Deal, with its call to foundational, rapid change, even has a fighting chance of being realized amid the understandable skepticism. 4 years before her death, in a searing speech in 2014, the great sci-fi writer Ursula Le Guin envisioned hard times coming as she said, "We will be wanting the voices of writers, of artists, who can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope." Despite similar attacks that the Green New Deal is experiencing today in press and online, the early 20th century New Deal succeeded because its programs were really helping people, and because of the power of art, which had an explosion of creativity and a body of work in the program of the 1930s. In all of this, when I read Klein's chapter, I was reminded of a line that captures this so well, an observation not of Naomi, but Canadian Catholic bishops, who said decades ago that beauty will save the world. That beauty is a love that shares the pain. Part of this solidarity love is collaboratively developing a narrative, a story that helps us see that we are part of a long and complex collective story, one in which human beings are capable of deep change. As Klein writes, quote, "We are surrounded both by ancestors whispering that we can do what our moment demands, just as they did, and by the future generations shouting that they deserve nothing less." As Ocasio-Cortez says in that film that we keep referring to, and we'll put the link on our pages, please watch it if you haven't already seen it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see. And with that, let's get right to our presenters, who I'd like to introduce at this point. First, we will be having Dr. Dan Scheid, and he's a Duquesne University Associate Professor of Theology. Dan is also the author of The Cosmic Common Good, Religious Grounds for Ecological Ethics. His research focuses on interreligious ecological ethics, and he's a dear friend and so active in numerous ways in the Pittsburgh area, and an invited speaker nationally and internationally. Kirsi Jansa sees herself as bearing witness, supporting change, and connecting for good. Kirsi is a storyteller, journalist, and photographer, and she integrates these as a documentary filmmaker. Hopefully you've already seen her amazing sustainability pioneers and gas rush stories. Kirsi is also a climate educator and a Creatives for Climate artivist, as well as a therapeutic relaxation guide and a facilitator in training with active hope and work that reconnects. Like most of us who support a Green New Deal vision of the world, both Kirsi and Dan see themselves as citizens of the earth. Unique to Kirsi is being a native Finn who recently became a US citizen in 2018. So we are so blessed to have this father, mother, husband, wife, friend, neighbor, both of these team workers in love with the earth. So we're so grateful to have Dan and Kirsi sharing with us today. Thank you, Dan, and then Kirsi.
All right, thank you, Karen. Dean, I'm trying to share my screen, but I'm not having any luck. Are you able to display the slides?
Yes. Give me a second.
So I wanted to talk a little bit today about some intersections that I see between the Green New Deal and integral ecology. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, this is the text Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home by Pope Francis. Came out in the summer of 2015. The first encyclical, or the most authoritative document by a pope on ecology. So there are numerous statements that came before this, but this is the most authoritative, most comprehensive statement that the Catholic Church has ever put out about ecology. So I want to talk about four main ideas. The first is the idea of the Green New Deal as a moral vision, and I think this is an important aspect of Laudato Si. The second is the moral vision of Laudato Si, a phrase that Pope Francis describes as integral ecology. And then third and fourth are some final points about an ethic for politicians that Pope Francis mentions, and then finally a call to joy, spending most of the time on the first two parts. So the first part is that, like many other religious and spiritual leaders, Pope Francis points out that the ecological crisis, climate, and all the other interrelated crises are not just technological concerns or political and economic concerns, they are ethical or moral concerns. That really the root of these problems is moral and spiritual. So the way to address it is not simply through economic political policy, although that's vital, it's also in terms of moral vision. So the energy policies that we create, the Farm Bill, the tax code, these are all moral documents because they reflect our national and moral vision. A moral vision is a way of bringing diverse experiences into a meaningful whole. A moral vision is a way of describing how the way that we envision the world shapes what we consider possible, kind of sets the direction of where we think we're all heading together. It disposes us to see certain choices and to ignore other possibilities. It leads us to make some choices as beyond the pale of acceptable, and it shapes the way we respond. So part of the task of a religious and spiritual leader is articulating various kinds of moral visions that help us think through what is the world that we want to create together. Laudato Si begins with two rival moral visions. So if you get the chance, just read the first two paragraphs and you'll get a sense of the main thrust of the document as a whole. The first is a moral vision that emphasizes relationship, respect, and integrity. And this is where you get the title of the document itself. Pope Francis says, he begins with the words of St. Francis of Assisi, one of the famous poems by St. Francis called The Canticle of Creatures. And Pope Francis says, "Our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us." So this is the direct quote from the poem by St. Francis, Canticle of Creatures. And this is where the Latin phrase, or the Italian phrase of the document comes from, Laudato Si, praise be to you. And you can see the language of relationship here, the language of family that Naomi Klein describes. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbs. It's a moral vision, not a naive romanticism, but a moral vision rooted in relationship and of acknowledging the debt of who sustains whom. The other moral vision is the opposite. This is a moral vision that conceives of the world purely in terms of instrumental use, of exploitation, of domination. This is the second paragraph, Laudato Si. He says, "This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will." He calls this, he later describes this as the technocratic paradigm. But you can see, instead of the language of relationship, we have the language of slavery, of lord and master and plundering at will. The violence, Pope Francis says, the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is the great garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. And the previous slide, I should have said, is of a large garbage dump in Nigeria outside of Lagos. We have created entire parts of our earth which are just piling up with refuse from this way of life that we've established. A moral and spiritual crisis requires a moral vision. And here you see the link here between the sickness in our hearts, the violence in our hearts, is now visible in our oceans. It's visible in our air. It's visible in our own bloodstream. He uses extreme language, and later in paragraph 21, he says, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." Now, these are extremes, the technocratic paradigm where we exploit and dominate over the earth, or the language of Sister and Mother Earth, who graciously and generously gives us various kinds of herbs and fruits. Now, these are polar opposites, but I think it points to the severity of our global situation. Our misuse of the planet has been so extreme, we need a dramatic and drastic departure from it. We need drastically new visions to stoke us and to prompt us into thinking of the world in different ways. Pope Francis talks about different kinds of moral visions, or he roots it in different ways. One is the gospel of creation, but probably the most prominent one and the most prominent non-theological one is integral ecology. So I want to describe a few different parts or a few different elements of what integral ecology includes. The first is the idea of a broader vision of reality. Over and over again, Pope Francis says we need to see the whole rather than just isolated parts. We need a vision of the whole. I love this picture. You see the Milky Way, you see mountains, you see valleys, you see rivers. If you look closely, I think you can see human houses. You see flowers and various herbs of different colors, right? We need not just piecemeal solutions to different problems. We have to look at everything at once. So as opposed to an economic model that sees profit and negative aspects, it calls externalities. Somebody else will deal with that. The future will deal with that. We need to look at a broader vision of reality, all of reality at once. Another aspect of integral ecology is interconnectedness. It's about webs of relationships. So rather than, or in addition to seeing the earth as sister or as mother, seeing animals and fire and water as brother and sister, we also have to see the way in which all of these creatures exist in relationships together. Pope Francis talks about we cannot emphasize enough how everything is interconnected. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore and understand. We can't touch one part of the web without impacting a different other part of the web. And we see this poignantly right now in the midst of the coronavirus. The world and its people is intimately and inextricably linked. A sickness that starts 2 months ago in another part of the world, even with the greatest of measures, is going to reach every part of the planet. So we have a broader vision of reality. We need to see that everything is interconnected, and a critical aspect of the moral vision that the Catholic Church wants to bring, and other religious traditions as well, is the interconnectedness between social justice, and ecological justice. So Pope Francis says a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And this is a major moment, because in the 60s and 70s, there was at one point a departure between some environmental groups and religious groups, different kinds of tensions, some people prioritizing the earth and conservation, others prioritizing those who are sick, those who are poor. Pope Francis wants to emphasize over and over again, we must solve both of these at the same time, or at least must address both of them at the same time. And in fact, they are really the same cry. It is the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor together. There are a couple of examples we could mention about this. One is the example of Eric Garner. Eric Garner, as many of you know, all of you know, died in 2014. An African-American man who died while pinned to the ground in an illegal chokehold by a Staten Island police officer. As he died, Garner pleaded, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." His autopsy later revealed that he suffered from asthma, which contributed to his death. Asthma is a disproportionately common disease among African Americans in New York City, who tend to live and work amidst high levels of air pollution. So in a way, Garner suffered not only because of racially motivated violence, but also because the air in his community robbed him of a normal quality of life, the right to breathe clean air. So I can't breathe is a statement is a cry of the poor and is a cry of the earth. And it is the poor who suffer most dramatically the impacts of the cry of the earth. Another example, this is the Standing Rock protests. Miniwichoni, water is life. That indigenous rights, earth rights, and the care of the poor and the care of the earth, they stand together. And this movement was an interesting example of bringing together webs of different kinds of communities, veterans, indigenous, ecological, people primarily concerned with water, people, climate activists primarily concerned with stopping fossil fuels, people primarily concerned with the poverty on Native American reservations. So that it's the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor that come together. So with integral ecology, again, just to emphasize, a broader picture of reality, focusing on interconnectedness and focusing in a really poignant way on the way in which it is the poor who suffer the deepest effects of the pollution that we pour out into the planet. So the moral vision that he provides us, the spiritual response to the technocratic paradigm, to pollution, is integral ecology. In Catholic social teaching, the key points of Catholic social teaching are human dignity and common good. And Pope Francis emphasizes that everyone has a role to play here. Persons, families, communities, and of course, governments. Governments have an indispensable role because it is government's job to safeguard the common good. And in this moment, he's not naive. He recognizes how politicians function and how they need to focus on short-term gains and how what they need to do in order to get elected. But he offers a kind of ethic for politicians, a couple different dimensions. So he calls on them to try to find foundations for their political moral vision. He says, I ask everyone with political responsibility to remember two things: human dignity and the common good. Now, these are the foundations of Catholic social teaching. And ideally, they are also American principles. They are principles that transcend religion. They transcend economic class. They transcend political ideology, excuse me. These are the kinds of moral exemplars and moral call for moral action that we see in the coronavirus response. Social distancing, creating masks, donating the extra supplies that we have to our healthcare workers, prioritizing healthcare workers. These are principles that transcend political ideology, or should. So he asks for politicians to keep those two principles in mind and to act with courage. And he recognizes that reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility. So this won't be an easy, this is not an easy ask for politicians or for individuals, but it's an ethic of looking at the foundational principles that govern our nation and in mind to the future. So he asks them, what is the vocation and purpose of a politician? And it's to safeguard these principles. And he says, what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? So in a word, what is your legacy? What is it that you are holding power for? And if it is not for future generations, if it is not for the sustainable livelihood of generations of human beings and of the planet, what is the purpose of holding on to power? Francis knows that this kind of politics, which takes up responsibility for the future and acknowledges the costs, that it clashes with present-day economics and politics, the goal of short-term gain. But he says, if they act, if they are courageous, they will attest to their God-given dignity and leave behind a testimony of selfless responsibility. To act with this kind of honesty and courage is, in fact, to demonstrate one's dignity. And this is where government is a truly high calling and not just the refuge of scoundrels, as they say. Finally, and I'll keep this part brief, for Pope Francis, this moral vision is more than just a finger wagging of telling politicians to do the right thing and telling people to give something up. This is not about what we give up. It's about what we gain. A moral vision is not just one that works through the stick, it's also through the carrot and also through liberty and freedom, by offering us a whole new way of being that we had never even really fully considered or even dared to hope for. So the Green New Deal, I would suggest, is not about punishment, and it's also not about what we have to give up. I sometimes think of that idea of an environmentalist as somebody who wants them to sweat in the dark. No air conditioning, no lights, just turn everything off. No, this is about opportunity, and it's about joy. So Pope Francis's final appeal is to hope and to joy. This is not a lesser life or one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a way of living life to the full. So Christian spirituality in particular proposes an alternative understanding of life, one that is full of deep joy, deep freedom, deep satisfaction, and one that is free from this constant, incessant search for consumerism and always moving on to the next thing. So I think that that's the call that Pope Francis offers, not just to Catholics, but to everyone. So he concludes Laudato Si with these words: let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope. God, who calls us to generous commitment and to give him our all, offers us the light and the strength needed to continue on our way. And that is all I have. Thank you, everyone.
So hello, everyone. First, before I go to my slides. Okay, so here we go. What I'm gonna say resonates, it's pretty much the same message as what Dan was talking about, just using a different angle and different language, different metaphors. And I'm gonna, let me see, all right, now I need to go here. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking briefly about this, like in this new situation, what that means for Green New Deal or our work. And then I talk a bit about the art, and then I go to what we can do here in Southwestern Pennsylvania, especially so that we can create this broad, invite many people to work with us. And so, let me see. I see that there's some, you know what? This is not the, okay. So, and I'm gonna be, I see that I'm missing one slide here. I'm gonna be showing a lot of different links. So, but we're not gonna have time to go briefly there, but just briefly, and you can go and explore them then later. And all my presentations also, first I wanna give shout out to my collaborators, Mary Beth Manarino, Michelle King, and Anne Rosenthal. that we work very much collaboratively through our Creators for Climate Collaborative. And also this presentation, this is collaboratively created. So I am a filmmaker, I'm a Creators for Climate artivist, and I'm also a Finn, born and raised in Finland. And so just being from Finland, it just makes me a steady supporter of Green New Deal. But from being a reporter, my background is in broadcast reporting, and so I'm not a political activist. So what I'm saying here, I don't talk so much about the policy proposal, but I'm more talking about the background work, like what Naomi Klein also wrote, that how artists are needed in the first place to create the paradigm shift that what we need for us to have those policies then, so that we can have those policies. And she's my new hero. She's the Finnish Prime Minister, 34, I think. And this is her speech that she gave in Columbia University in New York on March 6th. And if you listen to that, or if you read through that, you will see that basically what she says is all about Green New Deal, and the basic message is about social justice, that we cannot resolve the climate crisis without making sure that everybody is doing well. So those are great sources. And in this situation then, that where we are right now, that we talk about flattening the curve, so clearly this is the opportunity for us to flatten the other curve too. Michelle sent me this link by Sonia Renee Taylor, a poet and a social justice activist. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. So Naomi Klein writes in the art chapter about the art in the during the new Green New Deal, or the New Deal. It was inspiring to read about the Federal Art Project. This is from Anne, sent me this slide. She has done, there's been so many artists who are just doing so inspiring work with the, you know what, right now this is, so this is from, okay. So there's so many artists who have done like amazing work, creating this collective mindset that then allowed us to move forward and create a system that worked well for, well, not all, but for many people, I guess. But right now, so that there is the, let me see where I'm going. Okay, so I asked them, my collaborators from Creators for Climate, that will give me words like, what does art, what kind of power does art have? Like what Naomi Klein writes, that art is the power to win the battle for hearts and minds that will determine whether the Green New Deal had a fighting chance in the first place. So these are the words that my collaborators, artists, came up with, that art has a power to connect people, help us see things differently, help us feel, challenges us, provokes us, explores us, helps us explore and play, vision alternative possibilities, co-create. Art can inspire caring and respect, stimulate dialogue, and encourage the long-term flourishing of the social and natural environments in which we live. Art also, and artists make real or visual or tangible what we imagine. And this is one of my favorites, that how do we tell the story of something that hasn't happened yet? Many filmmakers at the time, we see a lot of the dystopian movies, but I guess that all of us who are in this meeting right now, We don't want the dystopian futures to happen. We want to imagine something better. But right now, this is New Deal. The times were different in the New Deal, that right now it's like art is anti-funded. This is not like, there's not money flooding from this administration to the artists to change the narrative. So it's up to us, the people, right now to make the change. But this doesn't mean that even without the federal funding, there's so many groups doing just amazing work. And here's some links on the bottom of the page. We'll somehow figure out how you can see these slides. But there's this, for example, Artists and Climate Change site. Chantal Belladieu, she's a playwright from New York, New Jersey. And it's her and her collaborators are doing this work. I'm just going to go quickly through these slides here before we get to the local one. They started this climate change theater action. Check it out. They provide 50 free plays for community groups to perform these, create small screenings or readings in your own communities. They are all free online, so they just do beautiful work. If you need banners for any Earth Day activities or protests or wherever, check out the Dear Climate. Marina Zurko and her colleagues and collaborators have created climate meditations and these beautiful posters that are also free for all of us to print and make our own. And these are just a few of them. There's the Ecological Art Network, Eco Art Network. A lot of cool stuff over there. And this is what we're doing here locally. So our Creators for Climate Collective has been in existence since 2016. We got a small seed grant from the Climate in Urban Systems Partnership. And the idea was to start working with artists and start talking about climate crisis and climate solutions, and together start visioning what kind of work we can do locally here. So we have held 4 or 5 workshops for artists. Last September, we created a pre-dystopian survival game at the Carnegie Library, one of their theme nights, and like 75 people went through our playful engagement activity. We have had 2 art exhibitions, first at the UU Church and the second one at the Contemporary Craft downtown, the Satellite Gallery. If you see the cool globes downtown, those are many of them, 3 of them are created by our artists. Many of the artists are Anne Rosenthal and the Luna Project. It's beautiful because it's so collaborative, community-based art. Once we again get to go and visit the Carnegie Museum of Art Counterpressors exhibition. Vanessa German, another powerful voice for change and fairer society. Alicia Wormsley, just powerful change makers. Land art generator, new architecture and new solutions around the world. So these are I'm just gonna walking quickly through those because I think my message is mainly because I'm a communicator, reporter, filmmaker. This is where I think where it goes into like, what can we do that it goes like that. It's each one of us is called to find our inner artist and find our inner connector. And we all need to figure out the way how we can change the story. This tattoo is by my tattoo artist, Sarah E. Rivera. Another quote Michelle sent me by Arwadi Roy. And she says that talk calls us to imagine. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's the portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And that's why it's so, look at these numbers then. These are figures by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. This was pre-pandemic times. I'd be curious to see how these have changed. But imagine that 37% of Americans discuss global warming with friends and family at least occasionally. And these are some numbers then you see what happens locally. So this is the numbers, like here you see them, how they have changed since 2009 to 2019. This is the biggest challenge that we have, existential crisis, and yet we don't talk about it. Here you see numbers in Pennsylvania. 1 in 3 talks about it, the rest don't. You go outside of our Allegheny County, even less people talk about it. And this is where we are. As long as we allow climate crisis or our ecological crisis or our social crisis stay taboo topics that we don't talk with our people, we remain in a pluralistic ignorance. And that's when it goes like each one of us, it cannot just outsource it, and the artist cannot change the collective mindset that we each one has a role to play in this one. So that these are slides from Michelle, that we can move from this egological to ecological worldview, and that we move from this genius ecosystem to genius ecosystem. Mary Beth Manarino is a psychology at Chatham and climate sustainability educator. We hosted a workshop where Mary Beth asked a great question, and she asked each one of us to think of a time when we were trying to create a change, but that didn't happen. We were not successful. And just realizing that how difficult the change is. And those of us who have already started this work are kind of ahead. Those of the people, our friends, community members who have not, it's scary and it's even harder for them. So when we remember that, it brings some compassion to our conversations, and it is more likely that we will be heard. Our message will be heard. Here, there's 4 levels of listening. This is from Michelle, also these slides, and from the Presencing Institute, which is they do great work. So somehow for us to create the way so that as many people can be part of this great turning that Joanna Macy talks about, we have to find a way to have these meaningful conversations in a way that we listen, and we listen to each other, and have the real conversations instead of going from the downloading or factual debate. How do we move to the empathetic listening and eventually to the generative listening, where we can then tap into this collective creativity that is available for us all if we just choose so. Here's some practices. And Michelle, we led an exercise, and this is what I would have done. I would suggest you we do if we've met face to face, that just have a dialogue, and just explore this one. That what would it mean to live without blame? Because shaming is not going to help anybody join the conversation. What would it mean to live without praise? What would your life look like if you were to give up both praise and blame? And I think I'm going to skip, Dean, you can tell how we're doing time-wise. I'm wrapping up here. This is an excellent video. It's a 4-minute long video done by Renee Lertzman. She's one of the leading climate psychologists and engagement strategists, and posted by, created in collaboration with Alliance for Climate Change Education, The Secret to Talking About Climate Change. And I really encourage everyone to watch that, because it's just a different way of communicating and helping people, that helps people hear what we want to say. Some other resources before I wrap up: Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy by Joanna Macy and Kirsi Jansa is an excellent book. If you want to vision and co-create and get ideas what is already happening, visit my Sustainability Pioneers Facebook page, webpage. Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, has great information about circular economy, fair and circular, carbon-free, fair and circular economy solutions. I really recommend you to see this one, visit that site. And then just pause. This is the coronavirus. It's just time for each one of us to just pause, take a break, and listen and share. These questions are also from Jonna Macy and Chris Johnstone. I have asked your people that, what are we grateful for? What are we concerned about? And then what kind of a future do we want to co-create? Because grace happens when we act with others on behalf of our world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kirsi and Dan, and we'll have Brianne Moore help facilitate this question and answer. So between Dean and Brianne, we'll move into that phase.
There's a couple of questions. Shall we just begin addressing those and see? And I can queue up the YouTube as we go. So here, give me a second, and I'll come back with a question.
Sure.
Helen Gearhart asks you to talk more
Hi, Dean.
about. Oh, hold on a second. This will be a little easier. Helen Gearhart asks you to talk more about the Senius worldview versus the hierarchical framing of the world. She'd never heard that term, so she's curious about it.
You know, I wish Michelle was here because that's one of the slides from her. So I don't think because whatever I would talk about it is like I would be making it up. So I think it's just I'm gonna let the vision talk on my behalf. I'll see if I can bring it back here.
So that's the one question we have. I'm going to just get set to run the YouTube video and give people an opportunity to type questions into the Facebook comments. That's how we're receiving them.
Talking about climate change can be tough. I mean, it's not like something you can just casually bring up in conversation. But it's such a big, important topic. We can't just ignore it. And while you can't fix climate change all by yourself, you do have the power to affect the people in your life. So let's talk more about climate change. Here's how. First, think about all the things you want to say about climate change. And don't say them. Really. You see, if you just start going off on how bad climate change is, people are probably going to shut down. They may feel attacked and put up their guard. It doesn't matter how eloquent your words are. If the other person's not listening, there's no point. So here's the secret to talking about climate change. Listen. Listen to the other person. I know it sounds weird, but it's the most important part. You may think the goal is to convince the other person of your perspective, but that's going about it all wrong. The goal is just to have an actual conversation, and that only happens when people listen. So, how do you start? First of all, don't ambush people. Get permission first. If they're busy, no need to force it. Just try again another time. Distractions make talking hard, so it's okay to ask to shut devices off. Once you have their attention, start with a question about climate change. Remember to make it about them, not you. Ask about their thoughts and their perspective. When they start speaking, you have one job. Just listen. Resist any urge to respond right away. And whatever you do, don't interrupt. This might be the hardest part, especially if you have strong feelings or if the other person is saying something that you disagree with. But trust me on this. Just listen and be open to what they're saying. Now, if the other person doesn't say much, that doesn't mean you can go, okay, they're done, my turn. It's not your turn until you learn something about the other person. So encourage them to say more by asking follow-up questions. Ask about personal experiences. No need to go into science or politics. Reflect back what you hear them say. Repeating and referring to their words lets them know that you are listening, that you care about their point of view. This makes them feel valued and safe. When you earn their trust, they will be more willing to open up and listen to you. So, after they've shared their perspective, then ask if you can tell them about yours. Okay, now it's your turn. What will you say? Remember, the point is not to convince the other person of anything. If you try to do that, they may become defensive and stop listening. Just share what you personally think about climate change. You may not be a climate expert, but you are the expert on yourself. So, tell your story. When did you start caring about climate change? What worries you the most? After you're done talking, ask what they think. Bring it back to them. And, you guessed it, listen. That's what a conversation is. A two-way exchange of ideas. Go back and forth for as long as it feels right. Learn from one another. At the end, thank them for talking and say what you learned from them. This is important. Ending on a positive note makes it more likely that this conversation will happen again. You see, one little chat may not change anyone's life, but it opens the door to more climate conversations in the future. And that's how you build trust. Get others caring about climate change and make a long-term impact. You may be surprised how much you learn in the process too. So, what are you waiting for? Talk to someone about climate change. It may be one of the most important things you do.
I'm just reflecting a comment that was made in the comments. Our friend Maren Cook points out that Ron Gatos, who's an old friend of mine, has a company called Senius Strategies. He may have some thoughts about that. So that might be a thing for those of us here on the web conference who are not looking at the comments to look at, or for someone looking at the video later. But I'm not seeing any other questions. So, Kirsi, do you want to wrap up your part of it? I can just put you up on the screen. Is that something you'd like to do?
I went through my slides already, but basically from the video, I just wanted to share where this is the video so it's created in collaboration with the climate educators and climate psychologists. And so we work together with the educators from different states. And this is one of the videos that a lot of the educators show, even though it's created for high school students, so that they can watch it and start having these meaningful conversations with their parents at home. But basically, it's also very useful for any conversation, so that we somehow get beyond this polarization that, especially in this country, is just somehow we are everyone in this together, and we have to find, if we are to somehow get to the place where we can have a policy like Green New Deal, we have to be somehow find a way that even those who disagree with us, that we can have these dialogues of real conversations. So it's not easy, but maybe in this new world, these conversations will be hopefully easier, and each one of us just somehow doing what we can so that we can invite more people to work with us.
Thank you, Kirsi. Renzi, are you still on the call? I think it might be time for us to wrap up. I'm not seeing any other questions.
So if that wraps it up for questions, I believe that the next part of our discussion series is opening up the floor for any announcements about things that relate to the Green New Deal, or about any actions that anyone has coming up. I know things are kind of strange and still kind of clunky for a lot of us in the activist world, but if anybody has any sort of virtual events they are willing to share, or any other information about anything out there happening, now is the time to please tell us all about it.
Thanks, Renzi. I will post on our Green New Deal Facebook group page what we were just most folks should be familiar with the Fridays for Future that we've been supporting the student climate strikers, and they have asked us to post their strike for our climate Earth Day, April 22nd. It's a 24-hour live stream, and we'll post that on our Facebook Green New Deal page.
I think that concludes this discussion session, right?
I think so. This is Dean. The one thing I'm going to point out is that all of the links that were in the presentation, all the web links, we'll compile them together and put them in comments both for this video, make a separate Facebook comment so people can access those, and we'll put them on our website. So if anyone saw those blow past and are curious about anything, they can check those places.
Renzi and Dean, perhaps we might also want to just say that obviously we're continuing to week by week make our way by going in this pandemic shelter in place mode. But our April 19th was scheduled to be focused around the Earth Day action and supporting that. Just stay tuned, as we all are, to various online messages, primarily through the Facebook Green New Deal discussion page, as to how we'll proceed, because we were supposed to have at that time Brianne Moy, Heather McLean, Sean Chisholm, Mike Stout, and the Extinction Rebellion folks talking about movements and the Green New Deal. So just stay tuned, and we'll just, like I said, keep making our way as we go. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Carol, for making that announcement.